Imagine. Imagine growing up unaware that many people in this country, perhaps even the world, have already had their minds set about you, even before you were born. Imagine all the things they have already decided about you, having never met you, what they believe about your person and even your body, that you're a drunk, a criminal, that you're violent, that you're uneducated, savage. Imagine that they believe that your problems and issues are insignificant, that you as a person don't even matter. Imagine being thought of as extinct, that you don't even really exist. And when you insist upon your presence, suddenly you become the enemy to defeat, to be destroyed, no matter the cost. Can you imagine anybody really believing that? Believing that about the person you're watching right now on this screen, talking to you. How can anybody believe this? Yet they do, right now, today, as you're watching this. So how can anybody believe that? Where does this ideal come from? Tyler Sheridan, writer of Sicario and Hell or High Water, ends his problematic directorial debut with this equally problematic quote. Why would Sheridan want to attach his clunky action mystery to one of the most heinous things happening in Native country today, across the US and Canada? For someone like me who's interested in Native American representation in films, the answer is pretty simple. It is to lend his clumsy action mystery film an air of immediacy, of timeliness, and an attempt to connect with Native peoples today. But in the end, it only serves to elevate Tyler Sheridan's authority over the stories of the Northern Arapaho people who still live on the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming, the reservation of my birth, and where I've lived most of my life, and the tribe to which I belong. I am Northern Arapaho. I'm also a filmmaker. I'm an artist and a writer and a media educator. I currently teach a course at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside called Native Americans in Media. For the past 20 years or so, I've been specifically dedicated to looking at Native American representations in film and media. But my love for film stretches back to when I was a child, when my dad used to show the family films on Super 8. And you could say it's almost in my family lineage. Is my great-grandfather Charlie was in the old Tim McCoy westerns. Back when they wanted authenticity, they would hire Native Americans, especially the Northern Arapaho, to be in the western films. Now, I know this review will have to accomplish many specific things. First, it has to be a critique of the film itself using my limited filmmaking experience. Second, it has to educate viewers a bit about Native American representations in films, an issue that barely gets coverage, though there are a few great videos here on YouTube, links below. It has to be a critique of the film based on those representations, because representation matters, and how you're represented in media ultimately affects how people deal with you and your people. Fourth, it has to be a critique on the theft of cultural authority through such media representations. This review of Wind River has to be more than just screaming cultural appropriation. Fifth, it needs to be as informative a contribution as it can be on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women because Wind River does not attempt that at all. Lastly, it has to present a Native American perspective because once again, Wind River never attempts this. Like other reviewers, I am presenting my own perspectives and opinions on the film and its representations. It is a perspective that can be challenged, though. Not threatened, but challenged. You see, if I'm wrong in my perspective, or if you think I'm wrong in my perspective, your challenging it will lead to further discussion and examination of the issues. So please comment, write, let me know your opinion and views of this film and how they contrast to mine. Tell me how I'm wrong if I am. Because this will lead to further dialogue, and from this dialogue we can either, one will convince the other and we'll make the necessary adjustments, or we'll come to a compromise. Or, like many adults, we will, in agreement, simply disagree on the issue. I refuse to hide behind the adage of, it's only my opinion, because I find that vastly disingenuous. You don't offer an opinion if you think you're wrong. And saying that it's only your opinion is just a weaselly way of saying, I believe I'm right, but I'm going to be a dick about it and not allow you a space to debate. I will try not to be very wry or sarcastic in my presentation. I'll be as straightforward as possible in presenting my views and the ideas and concepts. Because you see, I'm affording viewers what has been denied to Native Americans in film almost from the beginning of the medium. Well, that is until recently, kind of. Since smoke signals, I guess. I've tackled the stealing of Northern Arapaho voice before in a written review of the Margaret Cold Wind River Mystery series. Spoiler, they're awful. Native American representation and first voice are issues at the heart of how everyone sees, treats, and reacts to Native peoples. Not only does representation matter, so does whose voice is raising the questions and count in every issue across the societal spectrum. Wind River fails at this on every level, including basic mystery storytelling. Wind River opens with a Native woman, Kate Asbilly as Natalie, running across a frozen wasteland barefoot. We barely see Natalie in her life before her death. We only see her with her white boyfriend right before her murder, but we never see her as a living human being, never interacting with her family, never doing traditional things, or just being a woman in the world, or even a Northern Arapaho woman being a human being. You see, her absence is the point. Her absence is her presence, as it has been for natives since the beginning of film. Later, she is found by Jeremy Renner's game and fish hunter on the lookout for mountain lions that have been attacking tribal members' ranches. An FBI agent, played by Elizabeth Olsen, enters the story, and when bureaucracy interferes with her being able to bring the FBI into the investigation, she decides to solve it herself and asks the Jeremy Renner character to help her, quote, unquote, track a predator, alluding to his innate native skills.
So why don't you come hunt one for me then?
We learn that Natalie is the daughter of Renner's native friend Martin, played by the solid Gil Birmingham, who is so good as the stoic, angry father. All the native actors are really good in this, despite the representational baggage. They should be in other movies. They are so good. So when the investigation turns towards the possible suspect being Natalie's white boyfriend, played by John Bernthal, the movie simply de-evolves into a standard action western showdown in an oil field complex. Bam, bam, bam. The murder mystery isn't really solved, but the murderer is simply coming out of hiding to attack the heroes. It all ends with Jeremy Renner having cathartically exercised his feelings and failings over his own daughter's freezing death. You see, Natalie's death was beside the point, and that is what this movie is really about. Jeremy Renner's own grieving and his need for revenge over his own daughter's death. It isn't a story about Native people and their grief, it's a story about Jeremy Renner's character's grief. Natalie then becomes less a victim and more a stand-in for Jeremy Renner's own grief over his daughter, who was born to a marriage and divorce from a Northern Arapaho woman. A character who happens to just be best friends with Natalie, who becomes just another invisible Native presence in the film. Wind River is really great at making invisible the very Native women it's trying to raise awareness of. The movie ends with Renner and Birmingham sitting in the dirt. Renner is in a cowboy hat, which has become a symbol of modernity in the West, and Birmingham in Indian face paint, which is not, both failing at dispelling stereotypes. Said Sheridan to the Rolling Stone magazine, quote, "I'm trying to demolish stereotypes behind those particular images with that scene. It's no longer the concept of two enemies fighting for the land, it's just two best friends bonded by pain, survival, and the idea of making their world a better place to live. So why does one have to put on stereotypical face paint, just like the old Western films? And why does it have to push Native women out of the story?" And the movie just ends with them sitting in the dirt. The everlasting image of the Old West remains, a stereotypically stoic Native man in face paint looking at the changing world around him under the saving grace of the white character, Jeremy Renner. Then that last problematic title graphic comes on screen before cutting to credits, the story having done nothing at all in service to those missing Native American women, except to allude to them at the very end for relevancy's sake. It has been stated over and over again in other reviews and articles that Sheridan is making a loose trilogy with Sicario, Hell or High Water, and now Wind River, which are supposedly done in a new Western film style. But this new Western film style doesn't seem altogether different than the old Westerns. Natives are still killed. Natives are still the bad guys. The natives are still lining the periphery of their own stories, lining the heels at the edges of their own story, culture, and authorities. They are still a threat, not to the white heroes of today, but as Jeremy Renner's characters will say over and over again, a threat to ourselves mostly. Though we are survivors, this place will eventually kill us. Armando José Prats looks deeply at these representations in his excellent examination of the Hollywood Western. Invisible Natives, Myth and Identity in the American Western, which he explores how the American Western movie influenced audiences' perceptions of Native American people almost from the very beginning of the medium. I really enjoy Prats's examination of the Western form. It's deep and eye-opening, but it comes from neither a Native American or a U.S. perspective on the Westerns, as Prats was raised on American Westerns as a child in Cuba, so it's really an outsider perspective on the genre, which I really admire and appreciate. And I know you're asking yourself, so where is the U.S. perspective in this review? It's the film. It's the film itself. And if you're asking where the Native American perspective is coming from, it's coming from me. I'm the perspective. And that's what films like Wind River do. It makes a perspective like mine invisible to you. In his book, Pratt states that the battle for the West has not really ended, and alludes to an ongoing, more subtle war that is being fought, now for over a century, which continues against Native peoples today, and it's fought mainly through their representations in film and media. Even revisionist westerns like Wind River continue to perpetuate a lesser representation of Native American peoples, despite their progressive intents. Many revisionist westerns will always work to make the Native visible in order to simply render them invisible. It is their very presence in the story that allows them to be rendered extinct, such as Natalie's presence in the film. She simply becomes the catalyst for Jeremy Renner's catharsis and heroics, as many women throughout film continue to do. How many of these films do this? Lie in presenting natives in such a manner that their destruction is all but assured, such as the native people's inability to function like basic human beings because of this place. This place, this place. Having all the native characters crying about this place is only tantamount to grief porn, which is the enjoyment of other people's grief or entertainment. Take a look at how the natives in Wind River are depicted. The film is very orthodox in its depiction of Arapaho men. Why does everyone seem to think that native men treat white women like shit? When first meeting Elizabeth Olsen, Gil Birmingham's Martin simply becomes an asshole and insulting towards her. Frankly, this is not how a family on the Wind River Reservation would grieve, isolated and alone. Martin's home would have been flooded with family and friends who would have stayed with him for days. All the native men, when first introduced, become sexist and insulting, as when Elizabeth Olsen goes to question the druggy son Chip and his friends. The young native man who opens the door is high, rude, and then he begins to hit on Elizabeth Olsen. So she simply ends up killing him. And this brings us to another trope of the Western film. It is a common Western movie trope that only the sanctity of white women is worth saving. And she is saved in the ending shootout, yet Jeremy Renner cannot save the native BIA police chief, whose death can be sort of seen as an insult to native law enforcement, nor can he save the county deputies. But he can save Elizabeth Olsen, thus the white heroine, saved by our white Western hero again, as it always has been in Western films. But Natalie was doomed from the moment she was written to be a Native American woman. As Prats writes in the preface of Invisible Natives, on the representations of Native women in Western films, quote, ubiquitous, to be sure, yet somehow hardly central to the action. She dies or else she disappears, all in docile compliance to the mythology that so harshly abuses her, unquote. If this were truly about raising awareness of missing and murdered indigenous women, why then was it necessary to show her rape? Isn't its implication enough? Isn't Natalie's death enough? I'm surprised no one is up in arms about this the way audiences got when Game of Thrones sort of implied the rape of a major character. Using this horrible act to justify your own authority is problematic to begin with. But why use it? To add titillation and shock value to your film? That only cheapens the character and taints Natalie's rape as exploitative. It is also problematic to the real epidemic of rape when we look on rape as entertaining. Yet Sheridan never accepts responsibilities for these portrayals, using the age-old excuse. Quote, I don't like being lectured to when I go to the movies. I don't imagine other people do either. I'm here to entertain. I like playing against expectations. And if you can tell my political affiliations, watching one of my movies, then I failed. But I want people leaving the theater with something to think, and think hard about. My job is not to give you all the answers. My job is to ask the questions, unquote. The emphasis is mine because once again Sheridan hides behind that old excuse to remove his responsibility to the veracity of his representation and excuse his exploitation of Natalie's rape, which has now been reduced to mere entertainment because, as he states, I'm here to entertain. The real-life situation in Native country is that rape and assault is all too real, and Native women do not need another white man in front of or behind the camera telling them once again that rape is bad. The rape scene only gives Sheridan the tenuous excuse to use that end title graphic. That's it. That's all he does for murdered and missing indigenous women. Why tie the stupid movie to such a serious topic? Just to ask questions? By the way, do you know who knows how many Native women are missing? Native people. Fucking listen to them. According to the Native Law Resource Center, Native women are being murdered at a rate 10 times the national average. Due to underreporting, the actual numbers are almost certainly higher. Not to mention the hundreds of Native families with a missing daughter, wife, or sister. In Canada alone, according to the 2011 study, while Indigenous people make up about 4% of the total population, Indigenous women make up 16% of all missing and murdered cases. In the United States, Native American women are more than twice as likely to experience violence than any other demographic. 1 in 3 Native women is sexually assaulted during their lifetime. And 67% of all of these assaults are perpetrated by non-natives. But to ask natives to speak for themselves would mean that Tyler Sheridan and directors like him would have to relinquish that authority that their depictions of native people give them. And who would give that up? Sheridan has the privilege to ask the questions. Everyone's thinking to let the Northern Arapaho do this for ourselves. He also has the privilege to walk away when it comes time to come up with the answers, patting himself on the back the whole time, as if he had something grand to contribute to the conversation. Wind River is not that contribution. The Native Americans of Wind River are still the other, even in this film about them. As Prats points out, the natives of Western movies have their space, but is always at the edges of the space of the same, of the white heroes who are a reflection of the white audience, where they have always been, since the camera first began rolling. Films such as Stagecoach, The Searchers, even progressive films like Little Big Man and Dances with Wolves relegate the native to lining the heels and stoically staring down upon the changing world that leaves them behind. The only authority on natives and native culture left being the white hero, who has suddenly become a better Indian than the Indian. The myth of conquest. The idea that the United States had a destiny to conquer the entirety of the continent. This has been perpetuated mostly through our history books, but visually in the entirety of the Western film canon. Most Westerns are typically white heroes conquering native tribes, or bringing tribes under subjugation. And if not, the white heroes typically killing the native peoples. According to Prats, by revisionism, I mean to designate a near-doctrinal system of iconography and ideology of narrative tropes and generic types that articulates the reaction against the myth of conquest. Sort of the conqueror's remorse for vanishing the Indian, where the motif of savage becomes one of nostalgia. And as we know, we have a great problem with nostalgia in film. As Prats puts it, the past is the Indian's immutable place in American history. Wind River does this by following the 3 principal tenets of revisionism in Western films. 1. That Native American vanishment is assured, irrevocable, complete, and irreversible. 2. The native can only confirm the white hero's transformation into the self-other, or the white Indian. And 3. The natives themselves cannot do any of the revision, which Wind River does for Jeremy Renner's character in spades.
You're looking for clues, but you're missing all the signs.
Because it does so, Jeremy Renner can proclaim about Natalie, she's a warrior, as if that's his right to confer that upon her.
That's a warrior.
She is a warrior, sure, but she is still dead in the end. It seems that in the world of these new Western movies, the only way for natives to be warriors is to die, with our white heroes crying over the fact that Natalie ran 6 miles in the snow, and yet it still was not enough. And it will never be enough, because while they are alive at the end, Natalie is still dead. Because Natalie was doomed from the moment she was written to be a native woman. You see, to reiterate, the battle for the mythical West has never ended. And this leads to the subtlest issue that revisionist films like Wind River have. Who holds authority over cultural information and representation, and why? In Wind River, Jeremy Renner represents what Prats calls the double other, or the self-other, a tired Western movie trope where, to separate the hero from the actions of his race, his knowledge about natives makes him separate from his own whiteness, without ever denying it. The double other identifies mostly a white hero who, however much he may have adopted Indian ways, and even when he explicitly censures the dreams of a civilized West, acts as an agent of the myth of conquest. Sometimes despite his Indianness, sometimes through it, the type of double other under consideration validates and justifies the ideals and aspirations of white civilization. The double other's knowledge of the Indian extends not only to a knowledge of how to defeat them, his knowledge is also of the sort that makes him an authority on the Indian. He is accordingly the principal source of most of what we can come to know about the Indian. Indeed, more than the Indian is this or that sort of creature, the double other often teaches no clearer lesson than that he is our unchallenged authority on Indians, regardless of whether he kills them or befriends them. Think Hawkeye from The Last of the Mohegans, Jack Crabb of Little Big Man, and John Dunbar of Dances with Wolves. They are a character etched in the solid foundations of Western movies, new amalgams forged to replace the image of the Indian in film, thusly from the American consciousness. Sheridan seems to think he is acting out against these old Western movie conventions, and he convinces his audiences that he's doing so. But he's not smart enough to make the point of their obsolescence, and ends up reinforcing them. Reinforcing the idea that his white hero is the authority over Northern Arapaho culture and space. Throughout the movie, Jeremy Renner never fails to tell the Arapahos about their own situations. He is constantly telling Elizabeth Olsen and the native people who live there how tough it is on the reservation. He never stops doing this. He is even allowed to jump in a police car and lecture his best friend Martin's son about how hard it is on the reservation. Chip can only sit there and take it, plaintively crying, "This place, this place."
This place, man.
Because he's the white savior, he is allowed to dictate morality to the tribal members. Because he can do so, he is able to commit acts of savage violence. Precisely because Sheridan makes him the central hero is what gives him the tacit authority over the experiences of the Northern Arapaho people of the film.
My family's people were forced here.
He even tells the revealed killer how it is for the Arapaho on the reservation for some reason. Then he simply kills him. Why explain the reservation to someone you're going to kill anyway? Yes, that is correct. Probably the most heinous thing in the story is that Jeremy Renner is allowed to commit a murder. While he does kill to save Elizabeth Olsen, and only Elizabeth Olsen, as heroes do in the end, he kills someone who is at this point virtually no threat to him. I mean, to me, this makes him no different than the story's revealed killer. And it goes to show you that once again, Native women are forgotten and pushed aside when it comes to the violent justice of the white hero. Natalie was never given the same chance to survive as the killer, which sends another destructive message, doesn't it? It is better for rape survivors to die in films, rather than deal with the pushback from society when they level accusations at their rapists, which happens in real life. But Sheridan is not interested in asking those kinds of questions. Questions that would actually make a difference in the systemic racism that allows missing and murdered Indigenous women to continue to be ignored as a problem. It would have really upset the cliché, the trope, to bring the murderer in for justice, especially on the reservation, then have the white citizenry rush to defend the murderer, as again would sometimes happen in real life. But again, Sheridan is not interested in asking those types of questions. So Renner is allowed to get away with murder. Why exactly? Once again, Pratt shows us, because of revisionism of the Western film form, quote, images of white brutality thus set off the hero's own claims, both about his Indianness and about his exemption from complicity of conquest. The white hero can commit this act of savagery because of this Indianness, given to him by his marriage to an Arapaho woman. But he is also exempt from its repercussions, celebrated for it even, because of his whiteness. You may say that justice was meted out on the rapist, but this is a falsehood, a lie. Once again, Natalie's rape and death are pushed aside in the story. Natalie is not Jeremy Renner's daughter in the film, remember? If it were justice, then Gil Birmingham's Martin should have been the one to kill the rapist. He would have been justified in doing so. But what sets Martin apart from Jeremy Renner that does not allow Martin to do so? Simple, he is not white. He is not allowed that justice, or so Wind River would have us accept. If it were true justice, then Natalie would be able to face her rapist in court and see him imprisoned. But that's not how it works, not in the world that Tyler Sheridan is presenting, nor in the real world, unfortunately. Wind River once again reinforces this old Western movie idea that only the white hero is the one who can set the morality in this world. Why not have Martin be the main character looking for justice, steering Elizabeth Olsen in the right directions? Why not let him be the authority telling her how tough it is on the reservation, cussing out his own son Chip about his life choices, before saving the county deputies and the BIA chief, and teaming up with Elizabeth Olsen in the end and bringing the rapist to justice, to the police? Why not let Martin work out his own catharsis in this? Why not do any of this? Because it would be doing something. It would be doing the very thing that Tyler Sheridan says he wants to do with this film. Tyler Sheridan had every opportunity in this film to turn around the representations of Native people, but he didn't do that. Not with Wind River. Because what sets Martin apart from Jeremy Renner's character? There's this racist idea floating around the Wyoming I grew up in that the natives can't get things together and need a white person to sort it out for themselves, just as Wind River does when Jeremy Renner has to revenge Natalie's death on behalf of Martin. That's what this film reinforces.
I'm a hunter, Martin. What do you think I'm doing?
If you find out who did this, I don't care who it is. You understand me?
I hear you. I don't even care about the politics of race. I just want a good film. I want a good story. While Wind River on its technical merits alone is a solidly made movie, it is supposed to be a mystery, but Sheridan seems to lose interest in building the mystery aspect of his new Western to show off that he knows people and wants to tell their story. As he states in Rolling Stone, you have to remember I was an actor in procedural television for 20 years, so I know that structure really well. Which is why I suppose Wind River played like a bad episode of TV. What makes a great mystery is that audiences are lost in the search for the suspect. Great mysteries focus on more than one suspect sometimes, and the tension is about which one is the true killer. Alfred Hitchcock excelled at providing the answer straight away, and the tension comes from if the protagonist would discover it in time or not. Wind River fails at being a mystery as its focus seems to be on the protagonist telling the natives about their own problems, as if they did not know, or worse, too stupid to know. One of the bigger problems with the movie is it purports to be about the Northern Arapaho on the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming, as shown by the bullet hole riddled highway sign. But from the beginning there are very few things that ring true about the place and depiction of the area and peoples. To start, the film was not even filmed on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, opting instead for the more picturesque mountains of Utah, so right from the beginning, in its very aesthetic, it is presenting a misrepresentation. There's nothing evocative about this film to me. It does not look like home, but merely an outsider's remembrance of it. Like Margaret Cole's Wind River Mysteries, by presenting only fragments of a native culture as a whole image, much of what we learn from creators like Sheridan and Cole reduce native peoples, in their cases my Northern Arapaho people, to merely desperate people who cannot seem to get their shit together enough to solve a murder, and will allow a white hero to come in and do it for them.
These kids expect to go to prison. It's a rite of passage.
Well, I think they look forward to it, 3 hots and a cot, and free cable. Anything's better than being here the way they see it.
Get off my porch and go do it.
Revisionism would absolve the national conscience through its hero by presenting this hero as the definitive and irrecusable American, fully and uniquely so, because he has been somehow cleansed of sins committed against Indian in the name of America. More important, however, the moment illustrates revisionism's recourse to the white hero as spokesman for the powerless Indian. Whether he acknowledges it or not, however, the revisionist hero benefits from the death of the Indian. Not even to mention what the community reaction to a murder would be. My own experience shows that most native-on-native crimes are typically solved almost immediately. The film represents my people in a way that is pretty standard for any Western film, a genre that Sheridan states he is remaking. No matter how seemingly intent on rendering a genuine Indian, revisionism never returns him from his presumed absence, never presents him except by proxy. Revisionism owes its existence as much to conquest as to the Indian. The revisionist does not tell his tale from within the Indian's world, but from within the conqueror's. This is not a good movie by any means. It is not even a culturally relevant film. It is most certainly not a Native American film. Let Native Americans make their own films and tell their own stories. The soft reaction will be that Sheridan is at least raising awareness with this film. That if not for him, the plight of the red man on the Wind River Indian Reservation would not be seen, and most certainly not the plight of missing and murdered indigenous women. So why do we give Sheridan the authority over the story of the Northern Arapaho? He barely does anything to address the truth of reservation conditions in his film for all of the authority given to him by receptive audiences. And he does jack shit about the murdered and missing indigenous women situation, only making them an invisible presence to be rendered absent again to sell his movie. Sure, the proceeds of the film are going to go to the Me Too movement, which is a fine cause, it's a great cause, but not in any way directly to help murdered and missing indigenous women. As a wise man once said, raising awareness, or in this case asking questions, is just another way of doing nothing. So what gives Sheridan the authority over this culture for those who do not know any better? All 3 of those scripts, they're all personal. But when other directors start poking around for that one, I find myself getting protective of it. Now Sheridan is not the first to sort of feel possessive over a Native American tribe and knowledge, or to try to adopt themselves into the Native American community. And because they do so, they feel they have this privilege of speaking out on Native American issues or on behalf of Native American peoples, never once thinking that they could use that to uplift Native American communities to speak for themselves. And that seems to be a hard concept for them to understand, to allow natives the space to speak for themselves. It seems to be a hard concept to grasp. Then when Native Americans insist on their own space, to tell our own stories, then there's that switch in mentality. Suddenly we become this enemy to defeat. When a Native American person says, oh, you can't tell that story, or maybe let a native speak on their own behalf, suddenly natives are against diversity, or we're being too politically correct, or you're being exclusionary. Never once thinking of the sovereignty that tribes have, or the sovereignty that we owe to ourselves. Suddenly Native Americans can't speak to all pain. This has been an uphill struggle for Native American communities and Native American filmmakers. That Native American first voice and self-representation in media are at the heart of almost all the issues that we face today. To be able to speak out on our own behalf, yet we are not allowed to, represent ourselves the way we want. Not in a historical sense, but as part of modern society. Which is something that people tend to forget due to the steady diet of Western films and television that sort of keep us in the beads and feathers, that promote this myth of conquest, that label us as extinct. Or in the case of Wind River, to present us as a self destructive people. Folks don't want to think they've been influenced by the media. Yet, when you look at the reactions to the Standing Rock Protectors or to the change of the name of the DC football team, they're all very angry. Some are very violent, virulent. Maybe they believe that natives have stepped too close or they've become this enemy to defeat. Which goes to show you how all these Western films and films like Wind River do impact the U.S. consciousness. So Native filmmakers must struggle against decades of historical representations to present ourselves as modern human beings. We must continually rebury our dead to tell our own stories. So if natives are doomed, who is left to speak about Native American cultures? Who is left to be the authority? Directors like Tyler Sheridan, Jim Jarmusch, who made Dead Man, and Kevin Costner, who made Dances with Wolves, of course, are not doing Native people any favors presenting us the way they do, or by maintaining that authority over how audiences see us. I know you're getting up to defend Dead Man, but if you watch it again, the Native American still dies at the end, but not before transferring all of his nativeness over to Johnny Depp. And no, Johnny Depp is not a Native American. He never identified as one, unless he could make money off of it, like playing Tonto. A tribe has never really accepted him as one, unless they could make money off of it from him playing Tonto. And the world has never really treated him as a Native American. If the world did treat him as a Native American, they would have just ignored him. If Johnny Depp was really truly a Native American, you would have no idea he ever existed. These representations only come through these directors' very specific gaze, truth be damned. But in the end, it is never really about asking questions. It is more about Tyler Sheridan being the one asking the questions, which only makes Native Americans invisible once again in the very story he wanted to tell about them, like all those Western movies did decades ago. So much for this new Western idea. This has been problematic throughout Sheridan's work. The first time I saw this subtle misrepresentation of natives was in a film he had written, Hell or High Water. Hell or High Water is about two bank-robbing brothers, played by Chris Pine and Ben Foster, being chased by two Texas Rangers, played by Jeff Bridges and Gil Birmingham. Gil Birmingham, who is once again very solid as the half-Mexican, half-Comanche sidekick, once again not playing his true native heritage in a form of reduction, and is made present if only to pass on his native identity to, well, white people in general. There's the scene where he is wistfully looking at the next bank that the brothers may target for robbery, when suddenly he just announces,
Long time ago, your ancestors was the Indians. So someone came along and killed them, broke them down, made you into one of them. 150 years ago, all this was my ancestors' land. Everything you could see, everything you saw yesterday, to the grandparents of these folks took it. And now it's been taken from them. Except it ain't no army doing it. It's those sons of bitches right there.
basically he is passing on his Native American identity to the victims of the banks, like the brothers, while at the same time never implicating Jeff Bridges and Jeff Bridges' character's racism, and tacitly giving his forgiveness for conquest. right before he gets killed in the climactic shootout. His role in forgiving all whites is done, and so then is his character. With the major difference being that now Gil Birmingham's Alberto is just as dead as his ancestors, and the banks will at least let their customers live, if only to get their money back. Sheridan seems to think that identifying as a Native American somehow excuses the actions of the brothers. When Tanner Howard, the more volatile, violent of the brothers, bear in mind, is confronted by a Comanche man named Bear, who, apropos of nothing, declares to Tanner,
"Do you know what Comanche means? It means enemies forever.
Enemies with who?
Everyone."
of course, in these new westerns,
Know
the
what
white
that
hero
makes me?
can take a Native identity very easily, as
No.
Tanner then replies,
It makes me a Comanche.
Bear just then sadly shakes his head, relinquishing his Native identity to Tanner. Bear accepts his vanishment in the story, while Tanner assumes the new identity of what Prats calls a new American amalgam, which renders Bear invisible in Tanner's newfound authority.
Lord of the Plains.
It is that authority, the labeling of Comanche, that allows Tanner's action at the end to be of savagery, of violence, and ultimately, it dooms Tanner. Because the Comanche are the enemies to be defeated, if civilization is to prevail. All of this is an authority that Sheridan is all too pleased to take for himself. Again, as Sheridan told Rolling Stone magazine about Wind River, quote, "The only way I can guarantee that these things were handled in a way that did not betray that trust was for me to do it. I've built enough of a relationship with that community that I could go, I'm thinking of doing it this way, is that okay?" Which is a question I asked a lot. A person who's never spent time in that world, or who would go at it in what some people call a social justice warrior-y kind of way, he stops and laughs. There are certain things they're just not going to get, unquote. Sheridan can be counted among those who do not get it, because his film just shows me, a Northern Arapaho, a gross misunderstanding of Native American culture and people. A gross misunderstanding of a Northern Arapaho culture and people. The misunderstanding of Native peoples in this film also made me realize that no one ever really understands the concept of face paint and why it still continues, or the old Plains custom of cutting in grief and why no one does it anymore.
That's what the paint. It's my death face.
You're right. How would you know what that is?
I don't. Just made it up because no one left to teach her.
Sheridan, it appears, does not know that Martin would know about face painting and its meaning, because it is a custom still practiced on the Wind River Indian Reservation. And as for the cutting in grief, he would also understand why it stopped long ago. Maybe one of his friends from the community told him about these things, and he said, I'm putting that in my movie. For some time I had been under the impression that Tyler Sheridan had friends on the Wind River Indian Reservation, but then I realized watching the film that the dialogue from this scene
You have 6 officers on your entire force to cover an area the size of Rhode Island.
Yes, I know that.
is actually pulled from this New York Times article. It is nearly verbatim. Even the end title graphic is lifted from this Indian Country Today news article. It then becomes obvious that Sheridan has never been to the Wind River Indian Reservation as I thought, or he would have known what natives really do when there is a death in the family. So Sheridan has probably never been to the Wind River Reservation and learned about it in that New York Times article. But because he has a good deal of friends in Indian Country who somehow speak for the Arapaho, and magically makes Sheridan unlike every other white director before him, he is for some reason allowed to become the authority on the Wind River Indian Reservation, my reservation, and an authority on the Northern Arapaho people, my people, an authority that viewers of this film will trust. Yet I cannot become an authority on my own culture and people for actually being a Northern Arapaho from the Wind River Indian Reservation. As the Indian surveys the spaces of the same, the white man comes into view always as an interloper, Yet the Indian's assigned position as outsider belies his own claims on the land. The hero looks upon the land adoringly and hopefully, and looking already possesses it, at least enough to tell himself that he is defending it rather than invading it. Let's face facts, folks. Wind River is not really about the Arapaho. It is never about the Arapaho. These progressive movies never are. Wind River is really about Tyler Sheridan's own real and imagined pain of being Tyler Sheridan on the fictionalized Wind River Indian Reservation, as represented by Jeremy Renner's character. It is the truth about reservation life being something Sheridan controls here. It is his truth of the reservation. Quote, I wanted the vision executed exactly as I saw it in my head. There was a lot in this story, and the wrong hands could come off as offensive. I didn't know if I could make a good movie, but I knew I could make a respectful one. I don't find any respect in these representations in this film. He forgot to mention making a truthful movie. In spite of any respect he thinks he gives, it is a truth filtered through the gaze of Sheridan, a man who has friends in the community, maybe, but has never experienced living there for the entirety of his life, never experiencing the life of being an Arapaho person and everything that comes with that. He has never experienced how the world treats an Arapaho person. No, he gets to leave this reservation whenever he wants, to ask questions and walk away, leaving the Arapaho to continue to deal with what life gives them. I live in a suburb of Chicago now, yet because of what people believe about Native Americans, thanks to movies like this, I can never really leave the reservation. When I was young, our family used to play the radio in the morning as the kids got ready for school. The small town radio station used to have a set playlist that was practically the same every day. And us kids knew it was time to go down to the gate to catch the bus whenever a certain program played. Now in this morning routine, we were forced to listen to Paul Harvey's news and commentary, in which the esteemed Mr. Harvey would just spout off nonsense about the news of the day or the past week, as the case may be. In this jumble of memories, what stands out vividly, so much so that I can almost recite it verbatim, was on one particular morning, I recalled the esteemed Mr. Harvey stating emphatically, if you want to get away with murder, head to the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming. It is the unsolved murder capital of the world. Now this confused me in a couple of ways. First, when I heard it and I was looking out the window of my home, I didn't see anybody murdering anybody right then. And that he also that was all he practically said about it. That's the only thing he said. He didn't provide stats, he didn't provide sources. That was the only commentary he made on the situation. Now, as I've gone through my filmmaking journey, I've learned a little bit about media literacy, and I try to teach that when I try to teach filmmaking. And through media literacy, I've learned that almost every piece of media has a motive behind it. Even the video you're watching right now has a motive behind it. And they get to this motive, or they explain this motive through its messaging, and there's several types of messaging. In advertisement, there's the overt, the obvious message, which is, buy my hamburger. But there's also the subliminal one, the ones that people seem to be, on the lookout for. The subliminal message being, if you buy this hamburger, you're going to get a date. It's the unsaid thing in the message. And people seem to be on the lookout for subliminal messages in advertising, but that's sort of designed in advertising. But what I've learned also was probably the more dangerous one, which is the not the overt, but the subliminal message. The message that is everywhere. It's just out there, and it's almost everywhere you look. And it's the message you see the most. And that's why you see ads for hamburgers on buses, on billboards, on television, hear it on the radio, in magazines, benches, everywhere. And that's sort of what is the point. So as I learned more about media literacy And looking back on what Paul Harvey said, I realized that the operative word he used was unsolved. So from this, I extrapolated or learned basically 4 things from this small incident since. First thing I learned was that having an esteemed authority figure state bullshit does not make it news. The second thing I learned was having an esteemed authority figure state bullshit does not make it a fact either, or the truth. The third thing I learned is that stated bullshit does impact how viewers and listeners interact with your tribe, your people, your race, even you as an individual. And the fourth thing I learned was basically that Paul Harvey was an asshole. Think about it. He was telling listeners that if they wanted to kill, they could come to my reservation and kill us with impunity. What this did, or the possible impact of this is that listeners would think that they could come over and murder us anytime they wanted. But it also sent the message that natives were murdering each other. So there's that characteristic violence that continues to be attached to native peoples in their representations. But if you examine the word unsolved, you see that maybe the unsolved murder rate is high due to that small population on the reservation. Also because any killing on the reservation falls under the jurisdiction of the government, the Major Crimes Act. And do you think the government cares about solving murders on an Indian reservation since they have been trying to get the land for well over 500 years? I tried looking up the murder rate for this video, but all I found were links to the tribe's Wikipedia page, articles that cited that New York Times article, and links to articles about the movie Wind River. And what I've noticed when looking at all these articles that cited the New York Times article is that none sourced the unsolved murder rate. Not even the New York Times article did. Think about that. Not one article was able to source the murder rate on the Wind River Indian Reservation. So Paul Harvey was full of shit. And I know you're wondering what this has to do with the representations in Wind River, but I think the connection is there. It's obvious. I feel that most movie audiences are going to be fine with this because unfortunately not only do we learn history from movies more so than from school, we also learn about other cultures from movies as well. Hidden Figures is the most recent example I can think of general audiences learning about the past and other cultures from the movies. Yet the story and those who experienced it and lived it were always here and have been for decades. Too many will take this as a cultural experience, which it is not. It's just a white director asking questions. Then when films like Wind River are taken as a cultural representation, instead of a gross misunderstanding of a people and place, then we have all just learned misrepresentation as a truth. And that is the biggest problem with Wind River. Let's face it, everyone looks at Native Americans differently. As Prats puts it, the past is the Indian's place. When we try to voice our own concerns, to own our own histories, our own traumas, triumphs, culture, to own our own stories again, instead of the power to represent ourselves, we get pepper spray. When we try to raise an issue, we get "you were defeated." When we try to change a mascot, we get "you were conquered." We get "your culture is vanishing." You're all just drunks, druggies, or criminals. We get "I wasn't there." We get "just get over it." And suddenly, as a friend recently told me, that I can't speak to all pain. All Native people ask for is an honest, balanced human representation, blemishes, veneer, and all, what others seem to get. But that comes mostly from their having control over those representations, which is something that natives are continually denied. Those fair representations never occur in Wind River, which all native characters are either killed, arrested, or taken away, or they simply disappear from the story after Jeremy Renner lectures them about reservation lifestyle statistics, or treat Elizabeth Olsen like shit, such as when the great Tantu Cardinal does in her only scene in which she scolds Elizabeth Olsen. They will keep disappearing until all that is left is a suicidal, because of this place, face-painted Gil Birmingham sitting in the dirt, impotent in his search for justice, getting permission to grieve from Jeremy Renner. Now you're probably thinking I spent way too much discussing the representation of this film rather than its technical and story merits. Well, then you got the same issues that I did with the film. Representation matters because when you portray Native Americans as the conquered bad guys for nearly a century, a people protecting their country from invaders, instead of fellow fallible human beings, then you cannot help but always see us like that. To paint us with all the same brush, to view us with all the same lens, filtered through decades of misrepresentation proclaimed as fact, which gives many viewers the excuse to continue to see Native American peoples as always the enemy to defeat. Then there's the worst thing about this film. Tyler Sheridan, writer of Sicario and Hell or High Water, begins his problematic directorial debut with this equally problematic quote. My verdict for Wind River is that you can skip it. It does not represent Native Americans. To promote it is to promote misrepresentation. You would do better donating to a list of causes that I'm going to put in the descriptions. And so I will end this video with a quote of my own, again from Prats, that I hope that will be found problematic in the right way. This has been Once Upon a Time on the Res, a Northern Arapaho's review of Wind River, humbly submitted by Ernest M Whitman III, Northern Arapaho. Ho ho.